Yeah, well, good morning and welcome to our virtual Epsom Electorate meeting. This is a meeting for people who live and work in the Epsom Electorate, people that I normally would get a lot more opportunity to meet with at street corner meetings, town halls and other types of interaction, door knocking and so on, all of which has been much harder to do for the last few months. So not only has it been the summer break, but if you walk around the streets, if you are walking around the streets, you'll see that not many other people are. It's very quiet. People are very hesitant. They don't want to have to do 10 days of isolation if they get COVID, if they'd prefer not to get COVID at all. And as a result, we've had a lot less of that interaction. It's made it harder, I think, for all politicians to do their job, which is to hear people's concerns and aspirations, convert them into a political action plan and advocate better solutions at a national level. We will be back on the street corners, not door knocking on the doorsteps, and having a lot more public meetings as we always do in the Epsom Electorate, hopefully very soon as this Omicron wave peaks and subsides. New Zealand moves on, we get our way of life back and can take control of our own lives instead of facing a lot of government restrictions. In the meantime, this is a way to connect and to answer questions that people have sent through. I've had quite a few that have been sent through from people attending this meeting already. I'll try to address those. But just as a start, some of the issues that people have been raising. Well, one of them in our community, in central Auckland, Newmarket and the surrounding suburbs, it's crime. There's been a lot of disorder, a lot of antisocial behaviour, a lot of ram raids and robberies of dairies and our convenience store workers, people who are there from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. by themselves, often living on site, making sure that people can get that convenient bottle of milk or bread or Red Bull when they really need it. Those people don't deserve to be victimised the way they have all over central Auckland in recent times. There's people who are just seeing antisocial behaviour, and it's linked in large part to the government's policy of having to figure out what to do about housing, not being so sure how to get them built, so rehoming or reallocating people to a lot of motels, a lot of good people down on their luck in those circumstances, but also a lot of people who have really no support, plucked out of a neighbourhood they're familiar with, put in one where they don't know anyone, often not working, and that's when you get a whole lot of trouble for surrounding areas. What have we been doing about it? Well, certainly working closely with the cops. It's good to see 2 years after Newmarket Station closed, we now have a new police station in Teed Street, Newmarket. Used to be the TAB, so if you've been there before, just be aware that the building's got a different purpose now. But it's good to see a police presence in central Newmarket. We've also been working with them, with MSD, with agencies like the City Mission from over in the town, with Lifewise over on K Road, in order to try and work out, and also with our local business associations, people like Cheryl, people like Mark from the Parental and Newmarket Business Associations respectively, to work on closing the loop. If there's negative behaviour coming out of the people staying at motels, then most of the people staying there don't want to see it either. We've got to identify the troublemakers so that behaviour can be addressed. And I think we've had some success at doing that, but it's certainly a significant problem that has been laid on the doorstep of people who are just going about their business. And we'll keep working. We're always keen to hear from you if you're seeing difficulties with disorder, crime. Always happy to liaise, chase up the police in one instance. We did a public meeting on the streets of Mount Eden Village, and a few days later they actually caught them, and I think that's the kind of thing we need to see more of. We can't let a few kids doing ram raids disturb the peace and the ability of people to go along making money, running their businesses and safely serving their communities, because if you can't do all of that, it's hard to achieve any other goal. So we acknowledge there's a significant challenge with local crime, but I think the way our communities, our business associations, police, government agencies are working together, considering what's been left on our doorstep, is a really positive thing. Obviously a major issue that people are concerned about is the level of COVID restrictions. And you've got a situation where many people are quite fearful because for the first time, a New Zealander catching COVID is no longer a possibility. It has for a long time been a remote possibility. It's now probably for most people actually a probability. And you can understand people's anxiety about that. ACT's view, in my view, listening to people and representing this electorate and ACT supporters nationwide for a long time, go back as far as what we called our well-being approach to COVID in August 2020, is that at all times we've got to look at what the underlying science is saying and then balance the different human needs that people have for their well-being. Our view is, and we echo what, for example, Dr. Brian Betty of the Royal College of GPs has said, Omicron is a substantially different virus. Our Prime Minister liked to say that Delta was a whole new virus. Well, Omicron even more so. It spreads much more rapidly. It spreads much more rapidly in spite of most measures we take. For example, it broke through MIQ relatively easily compared with Delta and earlier variants. It has what they call immune escape properties, so vaccination is less effective at preventing its spread than it was for, say, Delta, and substantially less effective at that. And yet the good news is that it's also milder. So altogether, the costs of policies to reduce spread have remained the same, but the benefits are lower. On the other hand, the costs of it getting out and people being infected are substantially lower than they used to be. As ACT leader, I've put out a paper last week. We call it Move On, and the Move On paper basically runs through the different policies and restrictions that our government has put in place and asks a simple question: do the costs or the benefits outweigh the other? And it almost always comes to the conclusion that besides rolling out boosters, which we should do, and I think people should get boosted, there's substantial benefits from boosters, especially because your earlier doses fade in effectiveness. If you want to stay out of hospital, getting boosted is the most powerful thing to do. That should continue. We should continue having masks because while the evidence is varied and while the quality of the mask makes a major difference to the level of protection you get, wearing masks still makes a significant difference for the cost, which is mainly just that they're very irritating, that's imposed. Beyond that, we keep the border closed for what? You know, we're slowly reopening it. Aussies from Australia, Kiwis from Australia, and then Kiwis from outside Australia, and then other tourists at some point. But at the moment, we have no real cost-benefit analysis from the government. I asked the Prime Minister about this last week. She doesn't know how many more cases she'd get if we just opened the border. She nonetheless is keeping it closed, and it's devastating horticulture. It's devastating businesses that depend on foreigners. It's devastating local business people in the Epsom Electorate who need to travel to make connections. It's hugely damaging to our tourism business, obviously. So, you know, we need to start asking ourselves if having the border closed at all is making no noticeable difference to infection and hospitalisation rates when we've got 20,000 cases a day already, why do we keep doing it? And you can make similar arguments around vaccine mandates. 97% of people vaccinated. If you go out, you meet 100 people, you're probably going to catch it from one of the 97 who are vaccinated. That's now the statistical reality. Are there still benefits from excluding the other 3%? Probably not. If there are, do they outweigh the costs of marginalising a minority from society? I would argue they no longer do. And that's based not just on looking at what the data is telling us around the world, but talking to people in our Epsom community. So I think that, again, these ideas of mandating different populations or different activities should go. We should continue to allow organisations to make their own rules. And you see that schools might make an exception for a valuable teacher. You can see that while retirement villages might continue to insist on being vaccine only, and they should have the right to do that, midwives might say, look, actually, there's a lot of expectant mothers who'd rather have an unvaccinated midwife than none at all. So That's where we've come out on the COVID restrictions. They're doing enormous damage. I walk around Newmarket, for instance. Go into shops. I'm invariably the only person there other than the shopkeeper. They're putting on a brave face, but man, they are doing it hard. The number of people I've met who have had to mortgage or even in some cases sell their house to keep their business going. When we have a climate of fear, unworkable isolation rules, we end up with economies crashing. And that's before you talk to school principals who say, look, I feel like I'm an extension of the local public health unit. Very worried about the lost learning, very worried about what's coming through in kids' test scores, and this is through the range from primary to high school. People in those situations are trying to run a school and they're saying, look, I actually need to figure out when I get back to focusing on kids' learning. So we're bearing a huge number of costs from our current approach. It's not clear it changes the outcome, that most people will get it, and for most people it'll be a mild to moderate illness, and that's something I actually agree with the Prime Minister on. When it comes to this protest, we've seen extraordinary events, scenes that we don't normally associate with New Zealand, that don't really belong in our peaceful country. People lighting fires and setting gas bottles on fire, or throwing gas bottles onto fires on Parliament's lawn. Not something that you'd expect to see here in New Zealand, but enormously worrying for a range of people. Now, look, to unpack it a bit, I think it goes to a deeper issue that we are overwhelmed with information, and often people really struggle to process the amount that they have. So if you look at this protest, there are certainly people who have had the view, mainly reported by the mainstream media, that this is a bunch of ferals and neo-Nazis and it's all bad and good job, they're gone. There are also people who are relying on Facebook live streams from people within the protest who will say, look, I didn't see any bad things. These are just nice people down on their luck, feeling ostracised from the society, and how dare the police clear them out. The truth is that both of those things were true at different times. There were a lot of people who were there because, frankly, they felt they had no more hope. They hadn't been able to take their kids to swimming lessons or work or go to a cafe or whatever. In many cases, they actually, they were pro-vax. They'd had a bad reaction, or they were pro-vax and vaccinated. They just didn't feel it was right to exclude other people. I think people like that deserve to be listened to. What was challenging is that there were also people who were, openly saying that they wanted to arrest and trial politicians and journalists, and you had a real, threat of actual serious violence from people at the same time. The challenge for everybody is to separate those out, and when there are whole sources of information that don't acknowledge the other perspective, it becomes even more challenging. On balance, I'm proud of the way that I've dealt with it by going out and saying, look, if you guys are prepared to clear the streets, don't threaten people, stick to the message, then there's a potential for dialogue. If not, then I don't think anyone from Parliament should talk to you. I note that every other party leader within 24 hours adopted the same position. The tragedy is that nobody could control that protest even from within it, and as a result, that kind of dialogue never became possible, and we got to the very sad scenes that we had yesterday. What's needed now is to work through those challenges of conflicting and uninclusive information and actually start to have a dialogue about the future of our country. You should be able to criticise our government without being typecast as being some sort of radical fringe element, and at the same time you should be able to criticise those unacceptable behaviours without being seen or accused of failing to criticise the government. We need mature dialogue, and I have to say the behaviour of some government ministers, and particularly the Speaker, took us further away from that. The behaviour of some, but not all, media actors, where they really failed to take a balanced view and share all of those perspectives, didn't help, and neither did some of the activists who were putting out information on social media. There's a big challenge around open, inclusive and candid dialogue so we can move forward together from things like this. Something that people are asking about is the cost of living. This is the number one issue that people are raising with us if you take it all together, because it's affecting everybody every day. And again, it's one of these things where a mature evaluation will say, look, it's not entirely a global problem. That's the government's line. We ask them in question time, they say, oh, inflation's happening everywhere, it's not our fault. That's true. Just about every country does have an inflationary problem. But it's also true that New Zealand has taken a more extreme version of other countries' policies. We've isolated ourselves more, we've borrowed more money to support it, we've printed a huge amount of money along the way, and our inflationary problem is worse because fundamentally inflation is too much money chasing after too few goods. And what that means in the context of a COVID response is that because we closed the border, we have more supply chain shortages. People building tell me you can't get gibboard in New Zealand. I mean, it is just plaster and cardboard, but you can't get it. Extraordinary. At the same time, if you print an extra $60 billion, and if the government proposes to run a $6 billion deficit at the next election, next budget that's coming up in May, then of course that's going to be more money circulating. You've still got many restrictions from COVID that are reducing the supply chains, reducing the amount of goods circulating. You've got the natural response to, or the voluntary response to COVID, which is people have to isolate because they're ill or want to stay away and don't want to infect their relatives or colleagues. All of that is leading to fewer goods again, and the government keeps pumping out more money, so you keep seeing inflation in New Zealand, partly in common with the rest of the world, but to a larger extent. What we need to do is have some real reckoning around government spending. For example, Kāinga Ora have a $2 billion fund to go out, buy land and build houses. Well, it's not as though the private sector is not trying to build houses in New Zealand. What Kāinga Ora is doing is almost literally going along to auctions and bidding against other developers, raising the price of the land, then hiring all the best people, builders and so on, bidding up their prices, and the net effect is they're borrowing money to inflate the price of housing. I mean, I wish I was making this up. It's completely crazy stuff that we're getting from our government. And then you look at things like spending $50 million on a bike bridge that they never intended, or maybe they did intend, but certainly didn't end up building. That's $50 million circulating, but no goods for it to chase, so it's inflationary by nature. I talk to principals in this electorate. None of them can tell me what the extra 1,300 FTEs working in the Ministry of Education bureaucracy are actually doing, but again, $100,000 each on average, say. Well, that's $130 million of salaries, not producing anything extra. In fact, we've got real problems with student engagement and achievement, but they are, of course, spending money and inflating the price of goods, and that once you start to add all this up, you see where that $6 billion forecast government deficit comes from. So we've got to get on top of government spending. We've got to get on top of monetary policy. I think the Reserve Bank, being told to target price stability and employment, has decided to try and focus a bit on both, and as a result, we've ended up with much more loose monetary policy than we might have had, and people are seeing that in the price of petrol and the price of groceries and the price of housing, their rent, just about everything going up because of too much money chasing after too few goods. We, of course, are on that and trying to offer a better alternative, and you'll see that in our alternative budget that comes out in May. When it comes to Ukraine, this in some ways dwarfs every issue that we've spoken about. All the other issues I've spoken about are much more local. We started with the very local. What's the situation with crime in the Epsom Electorate? Then we've gone to some national issues, but the world has changed. And this is a product of changes that have been occurring over the last 15 years as we've watched fewer and fewer countries practicing democracy, and those that do practice it, shall we say, practicing it less openly and transparently, less democratically. And meanwhile, totalitarian leaders rising around the world, becoming emboldened, becoming more muscular and aggressive, and it's reached what I hope is the crescendo and soon to be pushed back with Vladimir Putin's totally senseless invasion of Ukraine. I think the problem is he's always lied. It appears now that he actually believes his lies, or he's trying to get us caught up in an even bigger ruse where he's bluffing about some of his more radical threats. At this point, the only way to be sure is to be stronger than the Russians, to be stronger than the totalitarians. It's for the democratic world to be united and for New Zealand to be playing its role. The walls should be going up. We should be saying to the Russian state, but I pause to say not to the Russian people, not to those Russian-born Kiwis who are our neighbours who are just as disgusted with Putin as the rest of us. It's very important. I'm really disappointed to hear people from that community saying that they're being targeted. I want to be clear, it's not their fault, but we need to be clear with the Russian state that the walls have gone up. No ambassador, no trade, good on Fonterra for not selling to them. We need to be clear that we stand against the senseless violence, the illegal acts of Vladimir Putin, and that we'll be doing everything we can. The Australians aren't messing around. They're sending lethal aid. They're sending the Ukrainians weapons to defend themselves, and to the extent New Zealand's able to, we should be sending a lot more than a few blankets over to Ukraine. I think that we really haven't done enough there. I'm just going to go to, but I'll just say a bit more about Ukraine. I think it's a turning point for New Zealand that we're going to have to get real. Our objective is going to be to have a strong defence capability, to stop messing around, wasting time and wasting money on all sorts of fanciful projects that this government's had us diverted towards, and start asking the questions, how do we make our economy productive? How do we make our defences stronger? And how do we make sure that in a world where there's a clash of civilizations and values, we are on the right side? I think for the last few years, New Zealand has been hugely distracted from those kinds of questions that for the people of Ukraine are now issues of survival. And if we don't start looking at that problem seriously, then we're going to be in serious trouble. At the very least, we should be looking to expand our defence spending to 2% of GDP. It's the least we could do for our Australian allies, who must be wondering where New Zealand is in that ANZAC alliance right now. Going to questions that people have sent through, someone says the best comment in Parliament yesterday was yours. Well, thank you. And the comment was the only thing this government's ever apologised for is the 1970 Dawn raids. Perhaps you can explain briefly tomorrow why it's so difficult for the government to apologise for anything. Look, I think it's a characteristic of our current Prime Minister. She enjoys the good times. She enjoys the limelight. She's less visible in bad times. I think that there should have been, for example, an apology that they got it so wrong on PCR testing. It's a simple thing. Normally they get a whole batch of samples, put them in one big test, and if they're all negative, they're all negative. If one's positive, they have to go back and find out which one it was. The difficulty is once you get to say 5% positivity, as we did last week, well, there's going to be positive tests in every batch. And even when you go and do a test of a positive batch to find out which one was positive, there's more than one. So, the 58,000 PCR tests we were promised were never going to be possible. And you could see that from the Australian data. You could see that from any country, actually, that once the positivity rate goes high, pooling doesn't work so well. And once pooling doesn't work, you can no longer deliver the volume of tests they have. They sent some of them to Australia to be done. They had others that still haven't been reported back. One question is, are they going to report people's PCR test results? If they're so late, the person would have recovered by now anyway, and if they are, why would they do it? That's an example of where we should have had an apology from the Prime Minister. We didn't have one. Then we've got Andy Bryan, David, please help consumers with rising food prices, push for more competition or regulate food prices. They're essentials, not luxuries. A couple of thoughts about that from Andy. Look, I think that the challenge that we have there is, first of all, regulating prices has never worked. And the reason for that is that if the government bans selling something above a certain price, well, if suppliers can't secure it for less than the price, then they can't make any money out of selling it. In fact, they'll lose money by selling it. So what happens is people stop selling, and if they do sell, they sell it on a black market. And New Zealand's got some experience of this. We've had a wage and price freeze from 1982 to 1984. Prices, when they rise, are the symptom of a supply and demand problem. They're not the problem themselves. Price controls are only going to treat the symptoms, and we're into solving root problems. The other thing that we get here from Brian is push for more competition. And look, I tell you what ACT would do. If we were in government right now, we'd be getting the top executives from the top 10 supermarket chains in the world. We'd be saying, look, we need a day of your time. Tell us all the reasons why you haven't set up a competing chain in New Zealand. Because at the moment, a country with only 2 competing supermarket chains, or at least substantial supermarket chains, is an outlier in the world. You go to London, they've got 8 in one city. We should have a lot more competition. I suspect a large part of the reason is that it's so challenging to build anything in New Zealand that people just don't bother. We need to make it easier to build. We need to make it easier to employ. We need to make it easier to get money sent from offshore. At the moment, we have one of the most stringent regimes in the developed world for stopping foreigners sending us investment capital. This is the kind of thing our government does every day that is just completely nuts, and people feel it in their prices. I think also we've got to recognise that the price of food in New Zealand is set globally because most of the things that we eat, we're actually competing with foreigners who are trying to buy them off New Zealand farmers as well. So the global price sets, for example, the price of milk in New Zealand. The wealthier New Zealand is, the cheap relative to the rest of the world, the cheaper that stuff will seem. And so there's a big story there about productivity, making it easier for New Zealanders to build their farms and their firms and their families without having to be constantly caught up in compliance costs and regulation that is such a challenge for us. And then we've got Natalie says, please help us save Dovemar Robinson Park. 25,000 plus have signed the petition not to build the Erebus Memorial in the small urban park. Motat wants the Erebus Memorial, can care of it. Probably there's a bit of a typo there. Look, on this Erebus Memorial, in my view, it's pretty straightforward. This is an enormous tragedy. It has been made far more tragic by over 40 years of wrangling in the aftermath of the disaster, and more recently over the building of a memorial. I noticed Natalie says, help us save Dovemar Robinson Park. I mean, let's be clear. This is a 5.6 hectare park. This memorial will take up 0.5% of that area, down a hill, out of sight of most people. Now, we can talk all day about whether we like the design. There are things not to like about the design. We can talk all day about the process. There are things not to like about the process. But the idea that there's an easy solution, that it could just be moved to Motat, we won't run into so many of the same problems and objections we've had so far. I think, with respect, that's fanciful. This should have been built for the 40th anniversary. It should have been open in 2019. I don't think it's right to continue delaying it. And I also don't think it's right when there's been a legal and democratic process that has been gone through. The landowner, the Waitemata Local Board, is the landowner of the park. They've gone through their process. There's a resource consent process that's been gone through. This thing is legal. For what it's worth, Ngāti Whātua or Orake have taken the position that they support it being built. For what it's worth, many people in our community lost people in the Erebus Memorial. In fact, I dare say the Epsom Electorate was disproportionately affected by people being lost in the tragedy. The right thing to do is to let that memorial be built and put things in a bit of perspective. There are people who think this is the worst thing that's ever happened. Well, frankly, you have to decide what's important. Sometimes the government builds a memorial that you don't quite like in your local park. Other times a plane smashes into a mountain and 260 odd people lose their lives. I think we've got to get a bit more perspective and work out which one we're worried about here, but I certainly think it's important that memorial that's been allowed under due process is now built to finally put to rest a 40-year tragedy. Than says police are not investigating the burglary when reported. They're simply generating police report for insurance purposes. This is not the right approach to law and order. Look, I agree with that. I think what would be helpful is if we had stricter penalties for burglary. Our view is if you do 3 burglaries, then you get 3 years automatic. Because if you get caught for 3 burglaries, chances are you've done a lot more than that. The best thing we can do is take them out of circulation, make sure they're definitely in prison, because one thing you can't do from prison is burgle people's homes. And it seems to be a relatively small number of professional burglars we need to take out of circulation in order to stop burglary. But in terms of what are the police doing, well certainly, they're generating reports for police purposes. I agree, for insurance purposes, I agree with that. The question is, how do we make it worthwhile to catch them? The view we've taken for years and years now is you actually put them away for longer. That way, if they catch one, they can put them away and stop them for a while. Than also says, Than's got a number of things to raise here which are really worthwhile. Can you please look at the uncertainties created by the CCCFA legislation? So if you go back to early January, I became aware of this in December and wrote at the start of the year to the Finance and Expenditure Committee and said you have to have an inquiry into this. Shortly after that, the Minister of Commerce, David Clarke, you may remember him, he used to be the mountain biking Minister of Health, but now he's in charge of Commerce, God help us. He has initiated an inquiry by the Council of Financial Regulators. They clearly didn't want to have a parliamentary inquiry by the Finance and Expenditure Committee, but I hear from people in the banking sector that they are confident that that Council of Financial Regulators inquiry is going to deliver a result so they can get back to lending without these ridiculous rules. If anyone's interested in the CCCFA changes, the long and the short of it, as it said, every director of every bank's liable for $200,000 for every incident, personally liable for any incident where a person is put into hardship by taking a loan that they couldn't afford. And what's more, the bank has the onus to validate any information the person supplies. So you can imagine what this means. Every director of every bank says, whatever you do, don't put anyone into hardship. The management of the bank put in place Byzantine processes to make sure that they don't loan to anyone. And all of a sudden, you've got bank employees asking, how many times do you have fish and chips this week, and do you have a Netflix account, and what do you feed your pets? Trying to make sure that they've got a total view of your finances and you're not going to be in hardship if they give you a mortgage. What it's meant is a massive delay and rejections as well in many people trying to get credit. It affects not only people buying homes, but people trying to use home equity for small business reasons, people trying to borrow cars, even just people trying to get a credit card have been affected by these ridiculous rules. I'd like to think that I've done my bit to make sure that the political process responds. It appears that it has, and we hope that the Council of Financial Regulators inquiry initiated by the Minister will fix it. But if not, I still have a letter into the Finance and Expenditure Committee saying that if the Minister won't act, Parliament should, and we should have an open and public hearing so we can get to the bottom of this. So that's what we've done there. Michael says, let parents be in control of their kids' education, vouchers for education and parental choice. Look, Michael, ACT's policy is very simple. We spend about $250,000 per citizen on education. How do you get that? $15 billion education budget, 60,000 kids born every year, $250,000 per citizen lifetime. Our view is when your kid turns 2, you go to your bank, you open up a student education account. It's like a KiwiSaver. It's a controlled account. In that, you receive $12,000 a year that you can use for ECE, primary, intermediate and secondary, and you can take it to your local state school like you are now. If you're happy with that, that's fine. Your state school can keep its own zoning rules. That's up to them. But you can also take it to a charter school, which would bring back. You can also take it to a special character school, like a Catholic school, for instance. You can also take it to an independent school, if that's your choice. And I think if we did that, we'd put parents back in control of the education agenda, right now, too much of education is being driven out of Wellington, and kids today are being used as part of someone else's political project rather than trying to equip them to navigate the 21st century, which is what parents want and those kids need. So if you're interested in our policy, student education accounts on the ACT Party website, and we completely agree with you. Carol says, what do you think about New Zealand becoming more self-sufficient in fuel production with the resources available? Well, first of all, that's a very desirable outcome. It would be great if New Zealand was to become more self-sufficient in fuel. There are some physical, practical limitations on how we can do that. For example, we don't have great oil reserves. We have some gas reserves. It hasn't helped the government's effectively banned people for looking for them, but there's always going to be a need for New Zealand to import some of the fossil fuels that we need. At the moment, we're burning Indonesian coal at Huntly. It would be much better if we allowed Genesis to dig up, or some other company to dig up the coal in Huntly. After all, Huntly Power Station was built on a coal field. They now can't get resource consent to dig it up, so we're importing it from Indonesia. So, there's some things we could do, but we also accept we've got some limited supplies. Some people say the oil refinery should continue for New Zealand's energy independence. I'm somewhat conflicted on this. One of my first jobs was a summer in the sandpit, working at Marsden Point in the oil refinery. My grandfather's company was the electrical contractor for the original build in 1962 and the expansion in the early 80s. So I've had a lot of personal and family connection with the Marsden Point oil refinery. However, when people say it helps with energy independence, we've got to remember that the limited oil that is drilled in New Zealand is not actually used at Marsden Point. The oil has to be brought in by tanker. And if we're at a stage where we can't get oil tankers in, or we can't, or we're so compromised that our security situation's got that bad, then probably having a very exposed oil refinery on the coast reliant on oil tankers is not really going to help with our energy independence or security. If we are able to import crude oil, then we can also import refined petroleum. So I don't buy the security argument, despite my considerable personal connection to the refinery. And I think the other question you've got to ask is, how much are you prepared to keep it running and keep all the staff there, the very skilled staff at the refinery, just in case we need it in the future. And I'm not sure that's the best use of resources. Then what do we got there? Friends tell me, friends tell me that our mainstream news media are paid $55 million to support journalism, provided the media support the government's ideology and initiatives. This sounds like bribery of our news media. Is it really true? If it is so, please tell us what ACT's attitude is. Well, that's a really good question. I'm glad you've been asked. Where to start? First of all, I know just about all the journalists in New Zealand, or certainly the ones in the parliamentary side. I certainly know them and know many others. They're not out there to try and misinform. They're not part of a grand conspiracy. They certainly don't allow government interference in what they report. And I don't think they've been compromised by a $55 million public interest journalism fund. Remember, that's spread over 2 years. It's a $1 billion industry. I don't think 2.5% revenue has made them decide to give up on all their integrity. I do think there's a question around the amount of ad revenue that has come into the media over the last 2 years from the Unite Against COVID-19 campaign and the various other advertising campaigns. They have been splashing the cash there, and I suspect it's a lot more than $55 million. So that is certainly something that we need to look at. What are the terms and the policies for placing that advertising? That is a major issue. When it comes to the wider issue, I think one thing you've got to acknowledge is that the media as we know it has lost the majority, maybe 80-90% of their revenue to online advertising. So where TV used to be glitz and glamour and a license to print money, it's really not. Print is struggling to survive. Many people have forecast that print would stop completely. It lumbers on. The only area of the mainstream media that's really profitable is radio. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, you can listen to it while you're doing other things. Two, the cost of having somebody sitting in a studio talking to a microphone is much lower than making TV or delivering a newspaper to every household. So, radio has come through for those reasons. You look at a guy like Mike Hosking, hugely successful, but the costs of producing that show are pretty limited, which is good for Mike because I guess they must pay him. When it comes to the long-term challenge, the question is, well, how do we get good information and trust in media? I think that's going to come from having a much higher quality standard of journalism. But how do you get that? I think there potentially needs to be some form of alternative funding, but one that is designed in a democratic way that doesn't put someone in a position where their continued funding depends on the government of the day. And we do have some ideas around that. So we acknowledge the problem. It's not as simple as 55 million bought them off. There do need to be other solutions, and we have some ideas that might advance that. Tim says there's an opinion poll in early February conducted by Roy Morgan which showed National and ACT together well ahead of Labour and the Greens. Why do you not publicise this? Well, very happy to. It's true, there was a poll like that. Look, I think probably first of all, talking about polling is talking about us. I'd rather be listening to what people's concerns are and reflecting those back. Second of all, it's 18 months to go, so ACT's had some very good polling lately. Doesn't mean that we're going to rest on it. The only poll that matters is the election one, and that's still about 18 months away, so we're very focused on that. But it is worth looking at the overall trend. On election night, there was a 25-point gap. Labour and the Greens together got 58, ACT and National together got 33. Now, if you look at where the polls are, ACT and National, depending on your poll, a bit over 40. Labour and the Greens, depending on your poll, a bit under 50. So that 25-point gap has gone down to something much more like a 6 to 8 point gap. And I think as the challenges mount up, as COVID goes away, as interest rates have to rise to beat inflation, people see their mortgage rates going up just as prices are rising. People are going to legitimately ask, has the government really done a good job of COVID, or did they just borrow and print a lot of money, holding us off from the world for too long to get through it? And I think people also turn to other challenges like, well, the government was elected to fix housing, how's that going? I think the opportunity for ACT and National for that matter to show people a better way forward for our country is there, and that's what we're going to be aiming to do over the coming 18 months towards the election. Look, I want to finally thank everybody who's been watching and listening. This is not as interactive as I'd like. I'd much rather be out there doing the street corner meetings and the town hall meetings and the things that we did for most of the last few years. That will return. We'll be back to more interactive and more face-to-face. In the meantime, in my MP for Epsom role, which is what this particular live stream's about, I'm here to help. My email address is mpepsom@parliament.govt.nz. Our phone number is 095227464, and we're here at number 27 Gillies Ave in Newmarket, Auckland. If you think we can help you with a problem, you may be underserved by a government department or have feedback about government policy or how I can better represent you, then I hope you'll get in touch, because I'm proud to be your local MP. I know there'll be people watching from outside the election. As the leader of ACT, I really hope that you'll check out moveon.kiwi. That's our latest policy paper. We've done 4 policy papers throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. The first was a wellbeing approach to COVID-19. Then there was COVID 2.0, COVID 3.0, and now Move On. It applies cost-benefit analysis, weighing up the costs and benefits of different policies we have, and concludes most of them won't make any difference to the outcome. If what our hospitalisation load is, how many cases are, but they are putting large costs on people's day-to-day living. And it's time to move on. It's time to move on from fear and control, take back control of our lives so we can focus on how we get a healthier economy, and we can focus on how we get healthy and thriving communities, and so we can focus on deciding what our Kiwi identity is, and ask the question of whether this weird world where there's a country with two types of human, the belt of the South Pacific, is a good idea, or whether we should be aiming to be a multi-ethnic, outward-looking liberal democracy. I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you'll have a great weekend.